Welcome to Maxability. To unfold different layers of knowledge, stay tuned with us till the end of the video.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, whoever in various parts of the world. Ask any accessibility professional about the accessibility of colors, and then comes the pain of finding the right choice of combination. With WCAG 2.1, the new success criterion, there is more to discuss now. Let us talk with Ted Drake and understand his experiences on the saga of accessible colors. Ted Drake has more than 20 years of experience in accessibility. He is a global leader for Intuit, a financial software company. His small and centralized team created an inclusive development and design culture, having more than 600 accessibility champions. Ted has been part of various working groups and chaired various accessibility conferences. It is our privilege to have him today to talk about the various myths, nuances, and differences of accessibility of colors. Thank you, Ted, very much for being here today with us and sharing your experiences. All over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rakesh. You know, this is one of those topics that accessibility people love to hate because it's not a simple solution. It's not something you can just go in there and fix. You can fix a form input that's missing a label, but changing the color palette and the color usage across a website can take years. And trust me, I've been working on this at Intuit for 8 years and we're still working on their colors. So this presentation today is to help people understand from a design standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, from a product management standpoint, what are some of the issues that we're dealing with? Why does it take so long? How can we better understand the problems? And how can we ultimately create better experiences for our customers? I want to start the presentation today. I am currently in San Francisco. So I want to respectfully acknowledge the Muwekma Ohlone people who have stewarded this land, the San Francisco Bay Area, throughout the generations. So let's think about accessible color contrast. When someone comes up to you and says, color contrast, what is your reaction? Each person's going to have a slightly different reaction. Some of you will wince, some of you will smile, some of you will do this kind of, I don't know what you're talking about kind of reaction. So let's look at some of these. When you talk to designers about color contrast, now, by the way, there's going to be some pictures on the page, and if they're important, I'll let you know. So if you can't see the screen, I will describe anything that's important. For instance, on this screen, there's a picture of me screaming with this colorful, explosive color background. Designers get to the point where they just do not want to hear you say color contrast one more time. It becomes an irritation if that's all you talk about is color contrast, especially when you're trying to tell them they can no longer use gray text or they can no longer use gray backgrounds. So color contrast for designers, a lot of times it means you're taking away my creativity. For developers, this is a sign from the Mumbai train station. They just want to point to other people. Developers don't really control color contrast. They're like, well, you got to talk to the designers. You got to talk to my product manager. You need to talk to the business owner because developers are happy to change the CSS, but it's not something that they can control. Product managers, project managers, this is just not something they want to deal with. Why are you coming to me telling me that our color contrast is too low? How can we fix it? How do we prioritize this? Who is it affecting? What is the impact on business? Blah, 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 blah. Color contrast for PMs, it's just opening up more questions that need to be answered. This is a picture from a subway in Paris of what seems to be an angry, not too happy product manager. And finally, we talk to our customers. And when customers hear about color contrast, accessible color contrast, they're excited. This is a picture from Cubbon Park in Bangalore of two children playing in the grass with a big happy sun behind them. So ultimately, color contrast is for the users. We want our customers to be able to read, to be able to understand, and to be able to focus on what's important on the page. But in order to get to that point, we also need to convince our product managers, our designers, and our developers why accessible color contrast is important. Now let's think about the 4.5 to 1 battle cry. This is where we're always coming. You could practically tattoo #767676 on my forehead. That's how people visualized me as I walked through design rooms, because all they thought about was, oh no, here comes Ted telling me that our grays are not dark enough. We have this compulsion to always talk about color contrast because we throw so many errors, because we think that it's something that is easy to fix when it's not really that easy to fix. 4.5 to 1 is ingrained in our heads as to everything has to meet this level. And in order to really make progress, and believe me, I've learned this over the years, in order to make progress, you have to be flexible. You have to understand why colors are not meeting those contrast ratios. We have to dive deep into automated testing. We need to understand why is the automated testing throwing all these errors and how many of those are actually correct. So there was a recent presentation by Joe Devon for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and it was the State of Accessibility Report, SOAR. And he referenced a recent study by Webaim, and they did an evaluation of the top 1 million pages. They basically looked at the Alexa top pages. Alexa is a ranking of all the top pages. They went to their 1,000 pages, top 1,000 pages, and then they spiraled a little bit. And they came up with this huge report, and it's really scary. In the Webaim 1 million, 86.3% of websites had low contrast text. That's a huge number. That's essentially saying just about every website has low contrast. The problem with this is there's no sense of scale. Does this mean that every page, 86% of the pages are using 2 to 1 contrast, something that's so low that it's unreadable that the whole page looks disabled? Or 86.3% of those pages had one single element on it that was below 4.5 to 1. We don't know. And that's part of the problem with automated testing. So I went through some of the Alexa top 1000s, and I wanted to see what were the errors that were being thrown. Now this is with Wave. So I tested with Wave and I tested with Axe, just to kind of get a good idea. Wave is by Webaim, and Wave is a tool that wants to find all of the problems. Axe is a tool from DeQ, it's open source. Axe is concerned about false errors. They don't want you to be seeing something that may or may not be an error. If you see something in Axe, it's an error. So that's the difference between Wave and Axe, which is why Wave can throw a lot more errors than Axe. So let's look at something. This is the Intuit homepage. And I had been working with them in order to get accessible color. And so I was a bit surprised to find that our Intuit homepage had 6 or 7 color contrast issues with Wave. And it had 2 color contrast issues with Axe. So I looked at them and I said, well, why are these throwing errors? In the first one, at the top of the page, you see that there's a big blue hero area, big blue section. It says proud maker of QuickBooks, TurboTax, and Mint. It's white text on a dark blue background. And if you look at that, you say, that's not low contrast. That's actually meeting the 4.5. So why is it throwing an error? It's throwing an error because when the page loads, there's a slight animation There's a slight opacity difference. So when the page loads, it's actually a lighter blue, but that blue becomes a full strength blue within microseconds, you know, so it's not like the page loads and you have to wait 5 seconds before it becomes a full strength blue. It's just a moment. And it's interesting to see that Axe doesn't throw this as an error. Probably because Axe does wait for the page to be ready. Now, below it is another section, and it's white text, and it says engineering technology introducing Argo Flux. And you look at this white text and you see it's on a really dark background image. So why is that throwing a contrast? And the reason why is that this section is well below the fold. It's at the bottom of the page. So when the page loads, this doesn't load the image right away. It loads a background of gray text, a gray background, which is a placeholder, and then the white sits on that gray background. So when the person scrolls the text, they eventually come to this, and by the time they get to it, it's this nice looking dark background image, which is perfectly fine. There's no contrast issues with this. So from a user standpoint, there are no color contrast issues on this page. From an automated testing standpoint, there are automated accessibility color contrast. I have actually gone back to this team and I've asked them on that lazy loaded image. If you don't know what lazy load means, that basically means instead of loading all the images on a page, let's only load the images that are required to see the top of the page. That makes the page load a lot faster. And then as the user scrolls through the page, then we start loading the images that they're going to see. That's why it's called lazy loading. So they're going to change that light gray background image, the default placeholder background, to a darker gray, and that'll fix that one. But just keep in mind that automated testing saw 6 errors on this page. None of them are actually a user error. Let's look at another one. Google.com threw an error on Wave, not on Axe. And the reason why is at the very top of the page, Google has a period, probably used for some kind of performance tracking. That period is white on white, and it uses aria hidden equals true. So once again, there's no user difference. A screen reader is not going to find that period because it's hidden. It's white on white, so there's no visual impact. It's not meant to be content. And yet Wave is throwing this as an error. So this is part of that 86.3%. Let's look at another one. YouTube.com. YouTube.com is a huge visual wall of text and images. And at the very, very bottom of the left column is one string that says copyright 2020 Google LLC. That one string is 3.19 to 1. So with this huge amount of content, there's just a few digits that are at 3.19 to 1, yet that fails. And so that's also being listed as a failure on automated testing. Now you could say that is an honest failure because you do have text on the page that should be 4.5 to 1. But what's going on with here is that you don't have a sense of scale. Tenon, which is an automated testing framework, they were trying to work on sense of scale. So if I have a page that's 500 megabytes and 1 megabyte of that is inaccessible, that means that that page is actually much better than a page that has 10 megabytes of information and 1 megabyte. So Tenon does try to give you this sense of scale. Tenon is T-E-N-O-N. Let's look at one more. This is another top page. This is QQ from China. And we have a lot of blue links. Not everything on here is accessible. Some of these things are definitely low contrast. But when we look at the links at the top, they are 4.48 to 1. That is so insignificant between 4.5 and 4.48 that the user would actually not see the difference. Then we have inline links that are 4.42 to 1. Again, these to the naked eye are accessible. And so when you run automated testing against this page, it finds about 67 errors for color contrast. Of those 67, probably 30 to 35 are in this range where it's so close, but just not quite there. So the problem with automated testing is it doesn't tell the whole story. So when you go to a product manager or to a designer and you say, we've got to fix color contrast, you're going to need to give them more than there's a color contrast error on the page. You need to let them know, we've run automated testing, we've found these issues with color contrast, here's the severity of it. There's one item on this page and it's currently 3:1. Can we change that color to, 4.5:1 just so that that's no longer throwing an error? At least they know why you're asking them to do that. They may come back and say, there's a very specific reason why this is 3:1 and we don't want to change it. So if that is a good reason, then you need to account for that in your policy. At the same time, you may come to them and say, this thing is throwing 300 errors. And trust me, I've had some of these pages. We need to get rid of this section. And I'm going to show you a page that's part of Intuit where we have just tons of gray on gray. These are the things you need to prioritize. You need to let them know we're finding these issues. Here's why they should. So let's look at the goals for today. I want this to be a little bit more fun because color contrast is so frustrating. You end up pulling out your hair and things like that. But I want you to understand what are the overlapping requirements. Sometimes we want to fix something, but by fixing it, we actually might be hurting someone else's experience. We also have areas where this thing needs to be 4.5:1, but by making that 4.5:1, it also needs to be 3:1 here, and then this needs to be 3:1, and you end up with this stacking of color contrast ratios. And when you give that to your designers, you're basically saying, congratulations, you have these 3 shades of blue that you can work with. And that's just not creative. So you have to understand, if I give this the contrast it needs, what am I taking away? Where can I move around that? And then finally, some strategies for moving forward. Now, I won't be looking at the chat very often, but if you do have a question, maybe Rakesh can pull it up for me. I'd be happy to answer questions, but I should have time at the end. Now, one of the biggest challenges we have is the call to action button. Call to action buttons have a very specific purpose. When you have this wall of information on a page, the call to action is the thing that you want people to interact with. And it has to be different. It has to stand out. Because if it doesn't stand out, then you have other problems. So let's take a look at something. This is the call to action button for TurboTax currently. And for some of our other products. We use an orange. And that orange is not 4.5:1. You can see there's 3 buttons on this screen. One is a light orange with white text. This is our current call to action button. If we wanted to make that 4.5:1, then it gets really muddy, which is the middle orange. Now, when you see that middle orange, it's kind of muddy. It looks sort of like dirt, a healthy dirt, a kind of dirt that you'd want to plant stuff in, but sure enough, it's like a clay. That is not going to grab the user's attention. So when we have a call to action, we need to think about how is this going to stand out. So we did a test, and in fact, on our website, you can flip a switch at the bottom of the page, and it will turn those orange buttons into an accessible blue. And the blue looks fine on the page. It matches our color schemes perfectly good. But the problem is, when the call to action is the same color as all of the other buttons, then there's no clear call to action. It's basically saying, hunt through this page and try to figure out what's important and click in on it. So people that need a clear call to action are people, I have a colleague that went through cancer treatment, and I use him for testing all the time because he talks about having chemo brain. Chemo brain is when someone goes through a lot of chemotherapy, and after they finish the chemotherapy for a year, sometimes longer, they have a hard time focusing. And when a page loads for him, he wants to know what is the key element that I need to do. He doesn't want to have to sit there and look through a page to try to find the key action, because he loses focus, he forgets why he was there. Other people that need a call to action are people with low vision, especially people with retinopathy, glaucoma, vision that is occluded. They need to be able to find what is the key action. And also people with cognitive disabilities. If I tell someone, maybe with autism or something, I say, you need to go sign in for this, and there's nothing on the screen that is really helpful, then they might be sitting there looking around the page for a while trying to find it. Whereas if there is a clear element, then they're going to be able to go to it. So when we were looking at changing our orange buttons, we did some user testing. Now, on the screen is a replication of, it's a simulation of different visual disabilities. We did not show this replication to people. We actually showed the actual pages, and we had people that had cataracts, that were colorblind, had macular degeneration, retinopathy. But this screen just kind of shows you what they were looking at. The current color has an orange button, and the accessible had a blue button. And we asked them which one they could read the best, which ones they preferred. And we were surprised to find that the orange button had pretty much universal appreciation for low vision and color contrast, color blindness. And that's because we weren't using the entire page in orange and white. It was just specific call to actions. And when the call to action was blue, then it wasn't standing out. So when you asked them to find the sign in button, it was blue, or the file for free button, it was blue. They weren't able to find that as well. But when it was orange, they were able to find the button, and then they were able to figure out what it said. Whereas the blue, they could see the button, they could understand what it said, but it didn't have that emphasis. And let's look at orange and blue. Blue and orange are complementary colors. They're opposite each other on the color wheel. Orange is a warm color. Blue is a cool color. Warm colors tend to come forward to you. Cool colors tend to recede. So if you're looking at this, you probably see the orange as the image, the block that's in front of the blue. You probably don't see this as blue with a hole in it and the orange is the background. So that's one reason why people like to use orange and warm colored call to action buttons, because that call to action button will actually come forward and will be more actionable, for lack of a better term. So this is why, from an accessibility standpoint, we go to them and we say, this orange button doesn't have enough accessibility, doesn't have enough contrast. We need you to change this orange button. And the designers are going, we can't really change this orange button. We need this orange button because it gives the users a call to action. It gives the users a direction. And so this is where you can't just come in with a hammer and say, you're going to change that orange button. We've been working on variations. We've been working on red buttons, purple buttons, blue buttons, gradient buttons. We've been working with putting stroke, like a black stroke around the white text. This is where you need to get into a conversation with your designers. Work with them as a team. Try to figure out how you can come together with a solution rather than telling them what they need to do. Now, there's another argument that came up. There was an article published on uxmovement.com. It was the myths of color contrast accessibility. And it talks about how putting white text on a blue button might be lower contrast, but it's easier to read than the accessible version where you have black text on a blue button. And designers loved this article. I know that because I had about a dozen designers come to me with this article saying, look at this, this is great. There was a new article recently saying there is no myths of color contrast accessibility by Jeffrey Croft. Now, he had the same reaction I had. Why is this guy focusing on an inaccessible blue to prove that white is better than black? And what Jeffrey was saying is that it was really a null argument because you could have just used an accessible blue with white text. Furthermore, When you put that blue button on a white background, then the black is going to be acting differently than if you put that blue button on a black background, because the white background makes the white come forward. But when you put that on a black background, like dark mode, all of a sudden the dark text comes forward. So you're going to hear people talking about the luminosity. There are arguments back and forth about that, but also keep in mind that arguing about luminosity doesn't mean that you should focus on using luminosity as an argument to use a light background color. I mean, just use a regular accessible color, and you can see that that middle blue, which is accessible, is actually the easiest one to read between the others. I have links in the slides to those two articles, so if you want to learn more about them, I would highly recommend reading. Probably read the myths first, and then read the rebuttal. So I said earlier that sometimes your designers are going to come up with justifications for not using adequate color contrast. And we have one of those at Intuit, and that's the placeholder text. So we do a lot of pre-filled data. We do a lot of artificial intelligence. So basically what our goal is that when someone is filling out a new invoice or doing their taxes, that we do a lot of the hard work and we pre-fill the data so that they don't have to sit there and input every single input. Now, a placeholder should be 4.5 to 1. But when you have a lot of these inputs, the top two inputs on the screen, one is invoice date and it has a pre-filled data. The next one is due date and it has a placeholder. But if you're quickly looking at this, it's hard to tell which one's pre-filled data and which one is a placeholder, because the color difference between the data and the placeholder is not that significant. So we purposely use a placeholder that is very light. And we've tested this with users, and the whole point of a placeholder is it's a suggestion. It should be dark enough that you can actually see the suggestion. But when you see an input that has pre-filled data next to an input that has a very light placeholder, there is no question that the placeholder still needs to be inputted. And when we tested with accessible placeholders, what we found is that people were not filling in all the inputs. But keep in mind, the best solution is not to use a placeholder. The best solution is to use optional text, for instance, that sits underneath the input and gives the user the format that they need, mm/dd/yyyy or something like that. That means that that suggestion is always available. And that is our design pattern best practice, is to use that optional text. Also keep in mind that people will use inputs with that placeholder, with that super light placeholder, and they'll think, oh, this is great, I can add a search box without a label. I'll just add a placeholder, and then people will understand that this is a search box, but they can't read it. So you need to remember, if you're going to use a light colored placeholder, do not use it as a label. And trust me, that is a big and long argument that we've had. I think every accessibility person has had. Another thing that we need to put ourselves into the designer's shoes is visual hierarchy. When you have this huge page and everything is the same weight, everything is the same contrast, everything is the same size, it's essentially impossible to read. Your eyes will get tired, you'll glaze over. So designers use visual hierarchy to show this is the most important section. This is the secondary section. This section has great information, but we don't really want you to dwell on it. And in order to do that, they'll use larger fonts for the headings. They'll use higher contrast. They'll use lower contrast. They'll use spacing, white space. They'll put things together in proximity. They'll use repeating patterns. This is a screenshot of TurboTax.com. Yeah, this is TurboTax.com. And this is the lower end of the page. And you can see how the designers have used all of these methods in order to, as the person scrolls through the page, understand what's important and what's not. But there's a problem with this. If we have an accessible blue, And that accessible blue looks great when it's on a white background. But when you put that blue in the very bottom of the page against that gray background, it becomes something like 4.42 to 1. So when we go back, we're going to be redoing our colors again. When we go back to redo our colors, we need to make sure that we use a blue that also looks good against gray. Because it's really tough for me to go back into our TurboTax team right now and say, you need to change this link right here because it doesn't meet 4.5 to 1. And they're going to say, yeah, but if I change that link, that means it doesn't match the other links on the rest of the page. Or I have to change all the links on the page just to meet that one. And that's why you have to do this in a more strategic manner. I hope that made sense. From WCAG, there's a question about what's an accessible contrast ratio. WCAG 2.1 doesn't make a differentiation on placeholder. So theoretically, it should be 4.5 to 1. If you ask me, I think 3 to 1 is okay. I would prefer that it's definitely above 2 to 1. It just depends on how you're using placeholders. And like I said, we use placeholders not as often, and we prefer using pre-filled data. And the fact that we use a lot of pre-filled data is why we modify that. There's another issue that we have, and that's when you have links within body text. So like an inline link, I've got a picture showing of a paragraph, and in that paragraph is a link. So let's look at our color contrast requirements. The link to the body has to be 4.5 to 1. So that blue has to have a certain contrast. The text of that paragraph has to have a certain contrast. That text has to be 4.5 to 1. Now, the hover, focus, active, and visited states of that link have to be 4.5 to 1. So that you always know, and it's always readable. But further, because you have a link that sits within text, there has to be a 3 to 1 difference between the link and the text, because people need to know that that's a link and not text. So we can't take a black text and put a dark gray link in there because you'd have to use your mouse and basically move your mouse around the page and wait for something to happen. We used to call that mystery meat navigation. So there has to be a clear definition of the link. So when you get all this together, I believe it was Webaim. Yeah, Webaim came up with a page where they basically found these colors. Normal, hover, focus, active is red, normal's blue, visited is purple. They're really kind of boring. And if I went to a design team and said, congratulations, you have these 3 colors to work with, they would just ignore me. So we have to think about how are we going to meet all of these requirements. One of this goes back to the standard. Don't depend on color. So if I have an inline link, give it an underline. If you underline the link, then you don't have to worry about that 3 to 1 contrast ratio between the text of the paragraph and the link. All you have to worry about is 4.5 to 1 versus the white, the background color. So not depending on color makes a huge difference. If I go back to this one, the visited link needs to be significantly different than the normal link, because how do I know which links on a page I've visited? Think about Wikipedia. You go and you're doing some research, you go to a Wikipedia article, you open up 10 different links in a new tabs. Now I refresh that page, I want to know which of those links I visited. If they look the same, then I don't know. One of the things we can do is actually a decoration. I've got an example. It's a very simple CSS rule that says on visited links, after a visited link, I want you to insert a check mark. And you can see it in this paragraph. I have a simple check mark. When I go to a page and I see that there are 10 links that have a little check mark, then it's pretty obvious that those are the ones that I visited. But we have to go back and say, you can't just depend on color. Make a link obvious by putting an underline on it. And there you have it. So let's look at some color strategies. This is where some strategies I've learned over the years on how to actually get some momentum going with making color changes. And trust me, when I joined Intuit, we had a lot of color issues. So there was a lot of like banging my head against the wall. But we've made huge progress over the years. And it's not because being dogmatic and saying you're going to do this. It's about trying to become a partner with design and engineering and product managers. The one thing that's really critical is that there's more to inclusive design than color. And if your designers see you as nothing but a person that keeps coming to them and complaining about color, you're not part of their team. You are someone that keeps coming in and is a problem to them. They see you and all they see is color contrast and they kind of tone you out. And you can't do that. You've got to make them your allies. Now on the screen is a chair that I photographed at the Spastic Society of Karnataka in Bangalore. And this shows how design for this particular chair was done for a particular person. It has casters so it can move around. It's got an angled back to it. It's got a strap to hold the person into the chair. It's got a bracket that holds the legs in place. These are design solutions. These are ways that we can get our designers on board, have them do more than color contrast. I've gotten to the point with them that we don't talk about color contrast until the very end of a design presentation, because they need to know that they also manage focus management. They also should be thinking about how keyboard users design. They need to think about what's the alternate text for an icon. They need to be thinking about when a modal pops up, what receives focus? Is it the modal? Is it the first input? Is it a button? There's a lot more to inclusive design than just color. And so you really need to become a partner with your designers and not be seen as a speed bump. You might also be saying, how do I prioritize? How do I go through all of our products and try to figure out which screens need to be worked on first? These are some actual quotes that I've gotten from QuickBooks Online. We tie into our user voice of the customer. Things like, working in QuickBooks is killing my eyes. Can you make the fonts bolder and easier to see? The biggest problem I have, your fonts on background are too light. Color on QuickBooks Online, way too light. Can hardly read it. How do I make it darker? So listen to your customers. Your customers are going to be better than automated testing. They're going to tell you it's the invoice page that needs to be worked on. I don't really care about the banking page or the account setting page. So that's a key thing, is try to figure out how you can tie into your voice of the customer feed channel. And remember that designers love gray text. It's going to be really difficult for you to pull the gray fonts, the gray backgrounds away from your designers. I found this article, how do I convince my boss that gray font is legible? That just explains everything right there. And it was on a graphic design website. And this designer was basically saying, all my boss thinks about is accessibility, is contrast. And I want to prove to them that I can use low contrast gray because Apple and Google do. Designers are desperate for validation that gray fonts, gray backgrounds, gray images are acceptable. And you're not going to do that by hitting them over the head with gray fonts won't work. You're going to hit them over, you're going to get it to work by saying, let's work with this. Let's understand, why do you want that to be gray? The other thing you can do is you can say, okay, I'm not going to focus that much on that heading that you have that's gray. Instead, let's look at this part of your page where you have 100 gray links on a gray background. Let's focus on this first. Why do you have to have such low contrast on this section? And if we can fix this, then we can theoretically remove 100 errors from our automated testing. And automated testing is also problematic for developers because they try to run their automated testing and they keep getting all these errors. And so it makes it hard to go through the logs. So you can focus on issues like this. A few years ago, this was on every page. And now it's a matter of saying, oh, this page needs to be updated because it still has the old footer. So you can prioritize areas that are extreme. And then once you fix those extreme areas, it makes it a lot easier for your designers to then start attacking the ones that are the anomalies. I also think that you should really focus on areas below 3:1. If it's less than 2:1, it's not even readable. So I go to a designer and I say, why is this disabled? And if they say it's not disabled, then you're like, well, look at this thing. It's disabled. You can't read it. It's so light gray that it's disabled to the user. These are where you can help designers understand contrast by putting them in the shoes of the user. It's not so much, yeah, if I have this huge screen and it's super bright and I'm working on in a perfect environment, as a lot of designers are, I can understand, I can read that text. It says hit enter to see the results. They're not putting themselves in the shoes of the user who might be on a laptop outside a coffee shop and the sun is shining on the screen. So less than 2:1, this is where you should really be working on, especially if that object is not disabled. 2 to 3:1, they need to have justification. Why is it that they're using that contrast? They may have a reason. For instance, that may be a disabled element, or it could be a placeholder. So if they're using 2 to 3:1, they better have a good reason. Someone was asking about having multiple links in the same paragraph. I don't think it changes readability as long as those links are differentiated. So if those links have underlines, you know, you don't want to have a paragraph that's nothing but links. But if you have a paragraph that has 2 or 3 links, I don't think that's a problem. It's more of a readability issue. Now, here's where you need to be a partner. You need to start a conversation. 3 to 4:1. Why are you using 3:1 to 4:1? For instance, TurboText currently, this is new, they have a top navigation that uses gray text. It's not 4.5:1. So I'm curious, why are they using a light gray text for the top navigation? Do they want people to think that the navigation is not active, that it's broken, that it's disabled? Just doesn't make sense to me. So that's one of my next projects, is to go back to them and say, we need to work on this top navigation. I found another one where there's a sign-in link that's a light blue. It's the branding color of a product. So why are they using a branding color that we use on the icon for a sign-in button? A sign-in button that's almost unreadable because it's not dark enough. And it doesn't qualify for the orange exception. It's a secondary button. We want people to sign up, but at the same time, if they want to sign in, they should be able to find that button. And I also found another example where it was a big hero section with a gradient, and they had white text on that gradient. No part of that gradient was 4.5:1. So some of it was big text, and you can get away with 3:1. Not all of it, though. The legalese was small text. It should have been 4.5:1. So these are where we have conversations. So I have some action items for you today, and then I'll be able to take some more questions. Automated testing is great, but it doesn't provide scale. You can run Axe, you can run Wave, you can run Tenon, you can run any automated testing that you want. And it's going to tell you how many pages have errors. And it may tell you how many errors are on that page. But it doesn't tell you, is it, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, I can't read anything on the page, horrible experience, or this is a great experience, but there's one little single dot on this page that doesn't match. So we have to, as accessibility leaders, we need to provide that context. For prioritization, look at those sections below 3:1 and see what areas below 3:1 don't have good justification, and then provide clear strategies to your PMs. Don't just go to a PM and say, this is too light, it has to change. Go to that PM with some options. Like, for instance, if you're going to use that placeholder as a label, we need to put a visible label next to it so that we're not dependent on that placeholder. Listen to your customers, prioritize their complaints. I got one recently where the person, she prints out her invoice pages, her list of invoices, and she likes to put them next to her computer. And she said that our print style sheet was bad, and that when she printed the pages, the text was too light. Well, we would have never guessed that our print styles were incorrect. So it was nice to get that feedback from a customer so we could go back in and change our print styles. Empower inclusive design. Your designers should be fully engaged in inclusive design. They should understand situational disabilities. They should understand the social model for disabilities, which means I'm not disabled if I can do whatever I want to do. So if I'm in a wheelchair and I can just go right up to a door, press a button, go into the door because it opens automatically. I can go up to a counter of a coffee shop, and the counter is low enough that I can easily talk to the person, sign a credit card slip. I can then go over to a table, and that table is the right height, so I can comfortably sit at the table and drink my coffee. And then when I leave the coffee shop, I can use the restroom and it's accessible, and then I can exit with an automated door. That's not disabled. That in the social model, I was able to do everything I wanted. But if I'm someone that's able-bodied and I'm carrying 5 bags of groceries and I can't get into the door because there's no automated doors, that's all of a sudden someone that's normally able-bodied is now disabled because they can't complete the task. So think about the social model and get your designers to understand that. And get involved early in color branding situations. We don't want to come in at the very end and say that color is bad. We want to be in there when they first decided on that color. And bring your designers and engineers together. Have them talk the same talk. Let designers know about semantic markup. Let developers know about affordances and signifiers and why complementary colors versus harmonious colors. When people can talk similar language, then they can work better together. With that, I try to save some time. Rakesh, if you want to take any questions. One person asked if call to action has a custom glyph, then is it fine not having them underlined to identify as links? Call to actions are typically a button. They typically have a either a background color or a border. So a glyph, by the way, has to have a 3-to-1 rather than text. It has to have 4.5-to-1. If it's a link, an inline link, and it also has an icon, I think it depends on the design, whether or not it differentiates it between a link and body text. Do we have a tool to check color contrast on image? That's a good question. I use a tool on my Mac called Contrast, and it's basically an eyedropper. I'm trying to think of the main contrast tests. If you're a designer, then you should be using, if you're using Sketch, then there's one called Stark. And Stark would allow you to create those icons in the very beginning with accessible colors. The Color Contrast Analyzer, CCA, I wasn't aware that that did image color testing. Someone said, how reliable is ODY 3675? To be honest, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, maybe you can even, someone have questions, feel free to unmute and ask. And if you want to clarify anything, feel free to do so.
Okay, my question is about the glyphs I'm talking about.
Can you name yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Siri. So my question is, okay, if there is a gallery of images and I can have a button that which says see gallery or anything like that, gallery of images. And it has a custom glyph next to it, like a small rectangle with two rectangles or something, like which shows like it is a gallery kind of thing with a small, very small rectangle, like a item. So at that time, is it still for the users, for the end user, they can figure out, okay, see gallery image, even though it is not underlined. I saw the glyphs where we used for play button, where you use a rectangle, right rectangle facing like play button. Those kind of glyphs are fine, but this is the custom glyphs. So these kind of custom glyphs should have an underline to them for the end user to know it is a interactive element, or just having the custom glyph itself will provide them that information it is an interactive element.
So there's a few parts to this. If the glyph is the only thing in an image, in a link, so we have a button or we have a link and there's no text. It's just a glyph.
There is a glyph, small glyph, and next to it says see image gallery, something like that.
Okay. Typically, if it's the only thing if you just see an icon on a page and you don't see any text, you sort of assume that icon is going to be clickable, and so you don't necessarily need it to have an underline. But once again, this goes back to usability. If you have a glyph that's part of a link and the text is underlined, then the glyph should be underlined, because otherwise the glyph, if it's not underlined, then it's not going to be associated with the link. So if the entire link should be underlined.
Is it okay? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to, if the link is not underlined, then the glyph should not be underlined, because then that would make it seem like the glyph is a secondary link.
So you are saying it's fine not to have the glyph and the text next to it not being underlined. That should be fine.
As long as there's a 3-to-1 difference between the text color of the paragraph and the link color. So if I have a black body text and the link is a blue, and that blue has 4.5-to-1 against the background and 3-to-1 against the black, then you don't need to have the underline. Or if there's significant white space. So let's say that I have this big gallery, and at the very bottom of the gallery is a string with a glyph, and it sits by itself, then you don't need an underline on that. You could probably get away with it, because the visual space, the hierarchy of the space defines this object over here that sits by itself is probably interactive.
Oh, okay. Okay. So if it sits by itself and there is a space around it, that should be fine. And
yeah, where we have problems is when you have a link within a paragraph, or you have a set of lists. You have 15 list items, and one of those list items includes a link. Then you need to know that this list item, that text is actually a link versus the rest of them are just text.
Okay, thank you. Because why I'm having this question for you is, I saw where, as you said, in the list of elements also, instead of using bullet point or numbers, they use glyphs to keep in the listed item too. And also, if you are using the same custom glyph, but it is by itself, as you said, will the end user know it is a interactive element or not? But you said,
yeah, most of our glyphs are going to be decorative. Like, for instance, I'm showing a screen that has list items, and they have solid circles and outline circles to represent bullets. Those I would not expect to be underlined, because they're not part of the text. They're part of the list structure.
okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? It's kind of nice to give Siri answers instead of asking her questions all the time.
was just looking the chat. So if there are any questions, I think it's more about the discussion about the tools, different tools available for accessibility audits. Yeah.
There's a lot of tools. My favorites are Axe, Color Picker, the color contrast analyzer that was created by Paciello group. I like the contrast app that is part of that runs on the Mac, so it can be used inside web pages or it can be used within desktop applications. You know, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. I would also recommend ARC, which is a plugin from Paciello group. And one of the nice things is that it allows you to test font resizing, where you can test text spacing, word spacing, line height. It does all of those things. It's pretty nice.
Got you. Any other questions, anyone, please? I think that's all, Ted. Yeah, we're almost like 4 minutes off. We started in time. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Let me just give a quick plug. Normally, I come to Bangalore every October, and Intuit hosts the Intuit Accessibility Summit. We're still trying to figure out what we're going to do this year because of COVID-19. We're probably not going to have a in-person Intuit Accessibility Summit, but we're still looking into how we might do a virtual summit in either late October or early November. And the thing that we were working on was powering prosperity. So our goal, if we are able to run it this year, is to look at entrepreneurship within the disability community in India. So keep an eye out for notices later in the year. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing everybody in 2021.
Thank you, Ted. And that's a bit of disappointment we could not meet during season, or perhaps we could not meet you in your Intuit office this year, but perhaps 2021 should solve all that.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you for watching and being with us. Please like and share the video. Don't forget to click on the bell icon. And also, for more updates, subscribe the channel.